Hi everyone, welcome back to Poetology. If you're a new subscriber, I'm Dan, and I'm going to share what I'm reading for Halloween this year. There are just 3 books I would like to share with you and recommend you check out. And the first one of these is a poetry book titled 10 Poets Tell You Their Favorite Ghost Story. This is part of Sidekick Books 10 Poets series where 10 poets do something. They have these themed calls for poems and choose 10 poets to answer them. I think that's how it works anyway. They feature 10 poets answering the prompt that they have. This is answered very creatively by the poets. You usually get 4 pages of poetry. Some of them take it quite literally and chose an actual ghost story from folklore as their focus, but others took it somewhere else, for example, with an AI seance. Here, some of the poets transpose this somewhere else, as Janet Winterson does when she talks about AI in the next book. But my favorite part was actually the contributors' bios at the end, because they talk about themselves in the past tense as if they have died, and they describe how they died and what their ghost is trying to do. So, for example, Tim Cheng was a teacher from Hong Kong, killed by grammar rules. She was found at the bottom of a well in Glasgow. She is too timid to haunt, but can be heard crying in public. Yeah, they all tell the stories like that. This was fun, not necessarily spooky, but it was about ghost stories and thinking about death. And yeah, it's just a really creative take on the ghost story through poetry. I had heard about Janet Winterson's Night Side of the River, which is a collection of ghost stories, when it first came out last year, and I was waiting for the paperback to come out, which happened this year. I must say I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to read it, even though I absolutely love Orange is Not the Only Fruit and some of her other earlier books. I wasn't a big fan of Frankenstein, for reasons I will briefly explain later. So yeah, I wasn't entirely sure whether I would like this short story collection, and what happened is that I loved most of them. I was really into the stories of hauntings and the reflections around death and loved ones dying, and many of them. But there were 2 stories that featured trans characters where I had the same issues as I did with Frankenstein, and it was even more disappointing because I feel like in the meanwhile she could have taken feedback from readers more seriously and integrated them into her way of writing trans characters, or alternatively, stop writing about them. I had issues with that, and I'd like to talk about it a little bit more. One of the stories features an AI avatar from a virtual reality who uses they/them pronouns, and the narrator, who is their love interest and who, really likes them, keeps misgendering them. So basically she sometimes will say, "oh, they," as if that was a quirky trait of the character rather than their actual pronouns, and the rest of the time they get misgendered. This was a character with a lot of agency, not just a 2-dimensional avatar. So I found it very frustrating and disrespectful. And in the other story, it's hard for me to go in depth without revealing too much. It's based on a historical couple where one of the lovers was found to bind his chest and was clearly a trans character, and nobody knew about it except the woman he wanted to marry. And what happens in the story is that this is described as equivalent to a lesbian couple, and that totally erases his trans identity, obviously. So both of these things were really frustrating because it reminded me of Frankenstein and how the character Rye in Frankenstein is repeatedly misgendered, how his transness is seen to be the main trait, like his entire character is based on the fact that he is trans, and all of his conversations with people revolves around the fact that he is trans. I think actually it may be they. Did Rai use they them pronouns? I don't remember now. Anyway, they were misgendered throughout, and they were just like this kind of fascinating trans person. That's just the surface of it, really. I was hoping that Janet Winterson would have listened to some of the feedback on this and integrated it in her other writing, because on paper she is supportive of trans people. She did co-sign a letter countering some of J.K. Rowling's extravagant claims, but yeah, there's that. So apart from that, the collection is actually very good. So if you weren't thrown off entirely by Frankenstein, you might enjoy this as well, but I'm getting a little tired, to the point that I'm not sure I want to buy the Christmas stories that she's got coming out soon. Finally, I was in the Scottish Highlands recently, the Northern Highlands specifically, flew to Inverness and drove west and north and discovered that entire area. So I was looking for fiction that takes place in that landscape. And one of the books I came across was this 3-book series by G.R. Halliday, starting with From the Shadows. And this features a female detective called Monica Kennedy, and she investigates a series of murders in the region. And I just really wanted this vibe of the Highlands. Here it happens in November, I think, late autumn, early winter. The victims are young men, and I enjoyed actually this shift from, how often the victims are women, and especially young women in thrillers, than detectives are typically male. So I know recently there's been a lot more diversity, especially in terms of female detectives in series and everything, but it felt good to read that actually, and to see it written by a man but from the perspective of a woman. And I've now read the second part, Dark Waters, which was also very good, although I found it much more disturbing than the first one. I guess I'm quite a sensitive reader, so the second one was a lot, but I'm still gonna move on and read the third one in the series. And while I'm at it, this may not exactly be a Halloween read, but I also found this book, The Bookseller of Inverness, which is also crime fiction, but taking place in 1752. Again, it featured this region, although not as specifically. Here I found some of the place names of villages or lochs I'd visited, so that was exactly what I wanted. This was not exactly the region I'd visited, but there were elements of it, and it helped me get a better grasp on Scottish history, which I know very little about. And so I learned about the Jacobites and a lot of background reading that I would like to discover. This is it for this short Halloween video. I would like to talk more about ghost story classics and big books like Frankenstein or Dracula. Perhaps I'll make a longer video next year. But in the meantime, I would like to know what you are reading for Halloween and what your recommendations are. Thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video very soon. Bye!